those of you who don't know me, I'm Brad Shar, and I represent the third generation of the Shar family in the ownership of Lowy. And we've been working together with Herschel and Adler for years. If you didn't already know, Lowy recently moved at 59th Street in the heart of the design district for a home of 25 years in a townhouse in the Upper East Side. With the help of our publicist, Mrs. McMahon, who's here tonight, you should all say hello, we at Lowy have been hosting a series of salon-style evenings aimed at reacquainting ourselves with today's faces in the New York design community. In that spirit, of thinking about the closest relationships that I had in the art community, I reached out to my good friend Liz Feld and asked her if she'd like to co-host a cocktail event featuring a panel discussion, which she graciously agreed to do. The history between Lowy and Herschel and Adler galleries goes back a long way. Not only have Liz and I known each other since we were kids, but her dad, Stuart, actually worked with my grandfather, who owned Lowy since 1956. So we're not just friends and colleagues, but we work together almost every day. Further to having this old and established relationship, Shars and Felds work with many of the same people in the art community as mutual clients, and we've done so for many years to our mutual benefit. In thinking about how we'd like to illustrate our clients and potential clients the importance of and the unique nature of our relationship, it occurred to me that the way we work together leverages the expertise of many different personalities in our organizations and networks. And the panelists speaking this evening represent that synergy. The diversity of expertise afforded by these relationships has been extremely valuable to us, and I think can be a great value to all of you. Tonight's discussion will focus on creating and enhancing an art collection by promoting its growth in an appropriate way, and through the preservation, monitoring, and presentation of works in the collection. So welcome all. Thank you to Liz and Stuart Feld for hosting in your elegant gallery. We hope you enjoy the discussion.
And I'm a continuation of the warm-up act, but I just wanted to say thank you to all of you for being here, and I wanted to introduce our very esteemed group of speakers this evening. But I want to introduce Anthony Freund, who's with First Dibs, who will be our moderator tonight. Lauren Rich, who is our conservation and framing specialist on the panel tonight. Kate Shertavian, who is our private dealer and art consultant on the panel tonight. My father, Stuart Feld, director of Herschel and Adler and Herschel and Adler Modern, and Jamie Drake, a wonderful, celebrated, very talented interior designer here in New York. Enjoy the evening.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me. I tend to swallow my words, which is maybe not the best skill for a moderator, but you're not here to hear me, you're here to hear these great people. So I'm going to start asking them with my first question, which is, I always like to start on a negative note, and then work my way to higher ground. So since the topic that we're here to discuss tonight is presentation and conservation, I want to ask you all, or each of you, or anyone who's brave enough to answer, to share an ugly anecdote about when an artwork's presentation had disastrous effects on its conservation or its condition, if such an anecdote exists in your history.
I think I have one. Actually, this is a recent case. A client brought in a Paul Clay piece that had been purchased in '85 from Christie's, and the panel had wooden strips adhered to the verso, and it was placed in a frame. The wooden strips were done by the artist. He had adhered them and had covered the areas where he had drilled in the strips with plaster and then repainted over. The client who purchased this piece kept it in the box that he purchased it in for 30 years and brought it to us a few weeks ago and said, "What can you do about this?" The panel had started to sort of sink. It had this sort of concave quality.
Not a good thing.
Not a good thing. The problem is that that Paul did all this himself. So not only is it a problem to take it apart because it's done by the artist, but the restoration or his retouching had discolored dramatically from the original piece. So you have all these factors that really can't, now that the client didn't hang it on the wall like he was supposed to do, no matter how hideous the frame was, there's nothing we can do. So it's always a problem in conservation when you have an original presentation by the artist, because it becomes an ethical and an aesthetic decision, but really ethics are very important, especially when you have an important artist. So here is this person who's obviously upset that his painting is having condition issues, and we really can't do much about it because that's the condition. I mean, the artist has done this. So that's definitely a sad story.
Not ugly, but sad.
But it is important to note that these are the things that we take into consideration as conservators. Original condition, not necessarily, I'm not talking about dirt or grime or cupping, but what the artist has done versus what someone else has done does play a role in the condition. So it's always good to be mindful of that. Anyway.
I suppose from a
sorry,
you
go
go
ahead.
ahead.
No,
Niels
you-
is going to be
no.
much better than mine. Go ahead.
Ladies first.
Ladies, but now I'm doomed. So if you're looking at ripping off what you're saying, if you're looking at someone like Soutine and you've got an art, a client of yours coming to you say, I want a perfect Soutine. And you go, there is no such thing. He just wasn't that artist. And every great piece I see is being rolled and cracked, and the condition is often the best ones are in awful condition, and you walk close to a Soutine and you really are desperately worried about what's going to happen when you put the black light on it. Does that mean you don't buy the artist? I mean, this is a majestic piece. So this thing about finding the perfect piece at a good price and then thinking about the artist's intent, and his intent was to paint and then put them under his bed, as far as I could see, usually sit on them and then stretch them. I mean, what do you do with that? So you have to, this is the balance thing of having the educated eye and never misrepresenting what art is, which is an expression, and sometimes those expressions do end up under the bed. So take it out, dust it off, put it in a frame, and think about it thoughtfully and take it to good people to look after it. And it's really, those are the problems that you navigate on a daily basis with condition, certainly. And there's so many great artists where condition is really central to their work. I mean, they weren't always very careful.
Especially contemporary post-war.
Yeah, there you have it.
I remember that a number of years ago, a collector whom I had never heard of called me and asked if I would come to her home in a distant Midwestern city to tell her about the works of art that she had been collecting for the previous few years. And I said, well, I have no plans to be there, but it was St. Louis, no plans to be there immediately, but I do go occasionally, and I will call you. Well, as it turns out, about 6 months later, I was asked to speak at the St. Louis Art Museum, and I called her, and I said, well, I can certainly come the day before. And that was all agreeable. And when I arrived at the house, rang the bell, she came to the door, and before I ever got across the threshold, she says, now remember, I want you to tell me everything that you think I should know about the works of art I've collected. I understand you know. So I walked in the door. This is the door. I walk in, and hanging right here was a Winslow Homer watercolor that was entirely blue. Does anybody here know why it was entirely blue? Oh, you've heard this story before. Well, watercolors are particularly fragile and fade very easily. And blue, I think, is the last color to go. What to say? Well, I told her the truth, at which point she started wiggling her hips and saying, how dare you come into my home and tell me that my Winslow Homer watercolor is faded beyond recognition? I said, would you like me to leave? Oh, no, I asked you to come here. But I never said another word.
Well, I guess now, as a decorator, we know why Elsie DeWolf dyed her hair blue. I think we better think about the same thing. I have, I think, a very convenient memory. I only remember the good things. So I don't actually have, even after 38 years in business, a story exactly that fits that parameter, but I have one a recent one that's akin, which is a client who can be their own worst enemy. A client of mine called me up and said, her new Yo-Yo Kusuma overnight had fallen off the wall, and it was a work on paper. The glass had cracked and it had damaged the work. Well, it turned out she had asked her husband, who came home after a long day of work, he's not a picture hanger, to put it up the picture. And he used one of those sticky tabs at her instruction, because she wasn't really sure that was the place she wanted it. And so overnight it had fallen off the wall, and the broken glass had damaged the piece. So hire a professional picture hanger, or at least use a hammer and nail.
So then you immediately told her to send it over to Lowy, because they have this amazing conservation department. So
Obviously, Jamie, that's what you did.
well, let's talk about framing. So how can you be sure, and I guess I'll direct this to you, Lauren, how can you be sure that when you buy something that it's framed properly, and that the work is stable within the frame?
Well, okay, so I will use the auction houses as an example, because I practically live there between January and May. And they're a really good example. So, condition is in general really subjective, and I think it's really important to bring somebody who knows what they're talking about to look at a painting you're interested in, because just because something is torn or dirty doesn't mean it's in terrible condition. In fact, I would say most things are not in terrible condition. Really, you're looking at, like, if a certain percentage of something is gone, that's troublesome. But most of the artwork we see has been restored or conserved to some extent. Pretty much 90% of what you see in history books has been treated. And it's very subjective, but if something is, so for the auction houses, when I go and I examine a piece, I want to make sure that the paint is stable on the substrate, whether it's canvas, whether it's masonite, whether it's a work on paper. You want to make sure that the media layers aren't crumbling or flaking. And again, that's not to say that these things can't be fixed, but you want to know up front what the conditions are. And then you want to look at it under ultraviolet light. That will tell you if there's prior restoration, where it is, what kind it is. There are, without getting too specific, different mediums fluoresce differently under UV, but it will tell you the difference between something original. There's always exceptions, but 9 times out of 10, the difference between something that's original and something that's been done later. So that's always something you want to acknowledge, whether it's been lined or infused, whether it's been treated in some way for stability structurally. And then within the framing, framing, you just want to make sure that the frame is stable, the miters are stable, they're not loose. Again, that's not a deal breaker, but I guess the point is that you really just want to have somebody there to guide you on the right thing to buy. Because even if a painting, say you love, like what Kate was talking about before, if you love a painting and there are condition issues, it doesn't mean that you have to stay away from it. You just have to know how to approach it. And if it's worth it. And usually it is worth it. It's just whether or not you want to put the energy and the time into it.
And if there are condition issues, you can stabilize them at the point where it is always, or sometimes is it a lost cause?
I'm never going to say always, because
Right.
there are cases where it's a lost cause. But usually it's rectifiable. I mean, especially if it's an oil painting, they're very stable. I mean, again, we're talking about different genres have different problems, and I think when you move into the contemporary post-war market, things are a little trickier, but generally speaking, there's always a solution. I think conservators, their biggest job is to problem solve. They're outside of the box thinkers, and we're not magicians. We're scientists, but 9 times out of 10 we can figure out a solution to the problem.
But not for Stuart St. Louis,
No.
Winslow Homer.
No, unfortunately, no. Although, what?
Poetry, maybe.
Forgery, or actually, play on Stuart's story. There's an interesting example at Harvard right now. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Rothko situation at Harvard, the Sackler, but that's an example of a series of paintings that has significantly faded over time because the red pigments were very fugitive, and actually Rothko provided them blinds, and they didn't want to use them because they felt it didn't do it justice to the space. And so now they have these Rothkos that have significantly faded, and in order to conserve them and to show them the way they were done, they've used light, LED lights, to enhance the color, which is really interesting. So I guess it can be rectified in a way. In that sort of case. And they do show those pieces for an hour each day with the lights off so you can see the original condition. But, the other thing to remember is that paintings, artworks are organic things, and they have a lifetime. And it's okay for them to look old or weathered to an extent. Not everything always has to be pristine. We're not pristine throughout our lifetimes. So, and I always tell people, conservators are like a combination between geriatric doctors and plastic surgeons. Depending on the level of condition. So.
That's right. But increasingly, with more money that's being spent in the art market, you do want to make sure that...
Especially if you're spending... And it's a conversation I have with artists a lot too, is, you have to purchase good materials and know what you're doing. And of course, now, concept is very important, almost as important to some as execution. Sometimes it's more important. And it really, you have to know what you're walking into. So I always tell artists the potential problems they could have with certain materials, or if you're really interested in something, you love something, then I have a client who is crazy about 60s op art. He just loves it, and I could tell him that something is in horrendous condition that's going to cost $10,000 to fix, and he will figure out a way. He doesn't care. And if you're passionate about it, then go for it. As long as there's a way.
Well, Kate, I'm curious because it's your job to advise your clients to, buy or step back. So
Step back, step away, run.
yeah.
Yeah, how do you tell a client it's a bad picture? Well, let's attend to the framing thing, because I think that's fascinating. So I have never met a frame that has persuaded me to buy or not buy a picture, because that's my job. Coming here, Herschel and Adler, everything is perfectly calibrated to the piece. So removing an H&A frame provided by Lowy's on a beautiful Homer, you'd shoot yourself. You wouldn't do that. But go into the auction rooms and you've seen a piece from an estate and the picture is slipped and the frame is doggy, I get really excited. Take it out, have a look at it, and then think about its companionship. Then go and look at the archive of material. If you have the privilege of doing that, it's a great privilege to find a beautiful piece and think about how you're going to pair it, both with its frame and the space. There are great masters that do it for you, and there's also an opportunity for a client to educate themselves on the beautiful object by thinking about the framing. And if you think about, I don't know, a little, like a Sargent frame, what period, or a Hassan frame, or you have this luxury of thinking about the lighting at the period that the piece was painting, Or if you think about the wonderful Impressionist paintings that were put into Baroque frames, and they were intended, because they were cheap frames, they took their old pictures out and they put these new ones in. That was the nascence of these wonderful, what they called Impressionist frames. They're not Impressionist frames. So you have this whole framing discussion, which is great. And there are now occasionally, still occasionally, these great finds. You know, the Milton Avery that slipped in the frame and the border's bad and you can't see it because it's dirty and you just take it out, and it's taken out and you go put it back. And don't clean the glass and put it on the wall, and you hope that when the auction comes up you're going to be there. It doesn't happen so much because you have many competitors here that beat you to it. So I'd say framing is an entirely different, it's an independent business, and it should be. It is an independent tool. You have to think about the piece, its appropriate frame, and then the location. And you should have good resources for that. You should be speaking to a great framer, and you should also be speaking to somebody who's working with the mistress, which is the house. I mean, at least have a word with someone who's helping figure out where it should go. But these are exciting projects.
Well, Jamie, that makes me want to ask you: Do you frame for the work? Do you frame for the interior, the decor, or do you see it as a bridging component?
I think that one would never do something that I would think would be a disservice to the work, and I would never purposely disservice the work. But I do, as a designer, have a slightly different point of view where I come from. That is, sometimes it's the mistress and sometimes it's the wife. It depends who I call.
That's good.
But I look at a whole mise en scène, a whole vignette, and maybe a piece that the client has or the piece that the client's buying that they love or that is perfect, but maybe to my eyes slightly underscaled, slightly overscaled. And I think that we can address that to a certain extent with the framing. The framing can add a layer of complexity and dynamism to the art and to the overall scene. I'm looking at it as part of one important component of a total look.
Stuart, tell me about framing as both a dealer and then as a collector, because I think you have different approaches, you were saying.
Well, here we tend, with older pictures, we tend to, if they do not have their original frames that are of really good quality, we tend to put them into proper period frames of really good quality. On the other hand, if a painting has its original frame and the original frame is just awful, junky, there is no really good reason to keep it. Maybe you want to keep it as an archival item, and I can guarantee you that archival item will not survive your ownership of the picture. But for example, we have encountered really beautiful Heed still lifes in absolutely terrible frames, because he obviously was an artist who wasn't willing to spend any serious money to frame his pictures. And we have put them into beautiful frames, and they are now in collections like the National Gallery and up and down. A few other things I'd like to say, and that is the use of the black light. It seems like an interesting and easy tool, but unless you really know how to use it, how to read what you're seeing, it can be very confusing, because certain pigments fluoresce to look like restoration. And so you can look at a picture under a black light and say, oh, I'm going to stay away from that. All of this is restoration. The truth of the matter is, it typically is not. One other thing about condition, it's all relative. I have had pictures described to me as being in terrible condition. And by that, the person meant that it was dirty, probably never lined and flopping around a little bit on the old stretcher, maybe has a 2-inch tear and a little puncture. That's exactly the condition that we would like to acquire something in. Small local damages are really easy to deal with, but the picture that has been abraded that's something that you really want to stay away from. Love is a many-splendored thing, but if it's abraded, don't love it so much. Because that's a really difficult thing. And when you get through, you really don't have a picture that is really by the artist.
And abraded, you literally mean, sorry, the
Yes.
surface?
Yeah.
Scrubbed off, yes. Tony asked me to address the difference between personally framing a picture for Herschel and Adler and for ourselves. And we do have an active life as collectors ourselves. And our apartment is largely furnished with neoclassical furniture of the sort that is in this gallery and a few others. And we have tried to bridge the aesthetics of the picture and the furniture. And that is achieved by using the right scale. Maybe the ornament is a little bit different, but the scale needs to be right. And I think it's worked out quite successfully, so that a painting doesn't necessarily have to be rigidly in the style of frame that it would have had originally. You can be a little creative here and there. And of course, with respect to works on paper, drawings, sketches, many of these were never meant to be framed in the first place. They were working sketches that the artist had, so that there really is no right frame necessarily for such works.
And then in the gallery, your framing strategy is more consistent, as you said before, but with the time period. Will you do presentations for potential clients and give different framing scenarios?
Well, we just did that with Brad or whoever, where a client of ours had a Munnings painting and wanted it framed, and they presented, with digital photography and everything today, it's so easy, 3 scenarios, and the client picked one, and that's it, But I mean, what does an original Munnings frame look like? I mean, I'm not sure I'm an expert on that, but what he selected was fine, and I think in this instance, it was a somewhat neoclassical frame, and the owner has a house furnished in neoclassical furniture, so it will work perfectly.
So I want to ask, what is the most inappropriate or counterintuitive frame that you've ever seen on a work?
I want to answer that, having just spoken. At the time that the Metropolitan Museum was celebrating its 100th anniversary, there was a symposium in conjunction with the Department of American Paintings and Sculpture, of which I was formerly the curator. And I was happily asked to speak, and the subject I had was the 19th century artist and her posthumous public. And I interpreted that to mean what has happened to 19th century American art since it was contemporary. And I showed works of art that had survived in their original frames, but the famous Thomas Eakins, called The Swimming Hole, which used to belong to the Fort Worth Art Museum, and since they are now and have for a number of years been a contemporary art museum, it has been acquired by the Amon Carter in Fort Worth. But I showed a photograph of that painting in an aluminum strip frame with a 4-inch wide canvas liner. I don't need to say more.
I'd also like to know the most ridiculous frame that actually worked, counterintuitively, if any of you have ever come across that.
I actually think that, I don't know if either of them would like to speak, but I think either Bradshaw or Larry Shaw would be great to answer this question. If either of you want to. Spotlight, chime in.
I'm Larry Shaw, by the way, with Lowy. A lot of things that are coming to my mind when I hear this conversation. But yeah, every day we see an abomination come into our doorway. I'm chagrined to say that some of those abominations were perpetrated by Lowy 50 or 60 years ago. when the approach to framing was not as thought out as much as it is today. And I will say that having been in this business for 45 years full-time, and prior to that, under my father's guidance as a little guy, I will tell you that Stuart Feld, in the late 60s, when I came on board and he came on board, was the first dealer, when he came to Herschel and Adler, when we met, that had an impact on me in terms of framing art, 19th century American paintings, historically accurately. My orientation prior to Stuart was Kennedy galleries that had, every time a painting came in, they would take off the original frames and they put on the 222 or 333 or an L156 and L155 that. And you had all this inappropriate framing going on because there was no thought given to historical accuracy. We framed many paintings at that time for Jimmy Graham and other galleries that sold cowboy art in Rococo 18th century French frame. Now, you know, a cowboy in a sweet frame, I don't know, doesn't sound right to me. Well, we learned, we learned from that. But having said that, I think that Stuart makes a good point about there's such a thing as being too rigid, and Jamie makes a good point when you have to have a conversation with the interior as well. So there are a lot of things that go into proper framing in my estimation, and the most important thing is to have the dialogue between yourself and the custodian of that art at a particular point in time as to what the goal is in framing for them. Because after all, they're the ones that are going to be living with it in their environment, and it should look good in the environment. So you want to tell them what may be historically correct. Historically correct, by the way, can have all kinds of meanings. In the 17th century, Leopoldo de' Medici changed all the Renaissance frames from the 15th and 16th century and put on 17th century Mannerist type frames on these paintings for the galleries in the Pitti Palace, and made them all the Medici frames. So what is historically correct doesn't necessarily mean that it's not anachronistic. There's also a conversation I think to be had with contemporary paintings today, in that there you have a lot of room for license and creativity, the kind that my father had when he was framing, and he would put 17th and 16th century and 18th century frames on paintings that you would never have thought would look good in them. Dali, Picasso, they used to come in to Lowy, look at 17th century frames for their paintings, and in fact sometimes paint the painting to go into the frame. So the whole framing conversation is quite fascinating, and it pains me today to see in many of the exhibitions that I go to, no matter what the contemporary art is, whether it's expressionistic or whether it's minimalistic or whether it's conceptual, the same maple frame goes on. So there's no conversation any longer between the frame and the painting. I think that's a big mistake.
Yeah,
It also doesn't bode well for Lowy's profitability. So with that.
Well, you raised a lot of interesting points. I don't know which to develop, but maybe one. Jamie, I want to ask you, how do you feel about a cowboy in a Rococo frame?
Well, I think that it has to do with a lot about where we live today. And I'm not saying anybody's being preachy, but we're seeing things through our filter of today. And I think that when I think back about us clients who say, oh, I want something that's timeless. And it might be the traditional client who really is saying that more and more. Well, would you tell me that the great work that Macmillan did for, say, the Henry Fords in the 1960s, that anybody would think that looks timeless? No, it looks dated. Does Isabella Gardner's house look timeless? No, and that was appropriate for the time. And it felt right for the time. So I'm not sure that, yes, that the swimming hole in the aluminum frame with the liner looks awful to our eye today, but maybe that looked kind of right for that moment for appreciating something in a different context. There is fashion.
Probably made to make it look a little less old-fashioned at a moment when Akins and Homer even were not very
It sounds awful, by the way, but who knows?
It's no longer in that.
And I mean, you think about all of the pop art and the 70s art and things in the 70s rooms that are so admired now. But if you look at the period rooms themselves, they seem a little extreme.
Yeah.
And yet they're highly influential, I think, on our marketplace and our vision right now.
One more thing, if you look at French Impressionist paintings, let's say at the Met or the National Gallery, where there are two very, very major collections, most of those pictures, Monet's and Renoir's and whatever, are in what I call Louis Screwy frames. Louis XV, Louis XVI, Louis XIV, Louis Screwy frames. If you go to the d'Orsay in Paris and look at the same genre of picture, most of them, amazingly, are in their original frames. And what do those frames look like? They look like the same plaster frames that were being used on academic pictures of that moment. And you want to know something? They look terrific that way. They really look terrific that way.
Well, then back to the penchant for original frames, and you
Yes.
talked about them, saving them for archival purposes. So often I've had consultants, especially, but that was the original frame, but the artist had no money. And how do you know that actually that was the one that he put on, or somebody who
put
bought
on
it
by
for
the frame.
$10 didn't nail it on?
But to bring things home, the picture over here with the bird, these are pictures that were framed by the artist in California. And I happen to think that picture looks very well that way. On the other hand, if you were using that in a somewhat more traditional interior, I could see using kind of a simple Italian molding that might be 4 inches, 4.5 inches wide, very simple gold frame, and I think it would look terrific and would be a much easier blend with the setting than would that picture presented this way.
But you probably wouldn't put a Louis XV frame on it.
No. But I'm sure it's happened.
Kate, did you want to say something?
No, just today I was standing in front of a Basquiat that I really liked, and it was in an awful Picasso, just a really nasty frame. And I had that moment where I stood in front of it and said, oh, why would they do that? And I thought, it's the owner. It probably looked all right. You do have to think about the bridge between the picture and the owner and where it will live. And you have to just
There's a piece of furniture under it, and
And I was imagining this
around it.
collector being someone who'd never had heard about Basquiat in 1987 and decided would run out and go and get one, and it was a very traditional collection, and sure enough it was. The collection that it came from was predominantly a much more traditional collection, and they got brave one day, and they went out and they bought a Basquiat, and they brought it home and went, oh, what do we do with it? And they slipped it into a frame so it lived its life the last 30 years or 40 years quite nicely. I think you can slip things out, in and out of a frame. I just think that some frames do, like your liner and the strip, just leave them where they are.
If I can just interject a little anecdote here, apropos of this. Years ago, we had a client who was a dealer in post-impressionism, and she would come in to Lowy and order these Louis Screwy frames, as Stuart said. But to make matters worse, she had her own finish, which was this goldy finish with a pinkish wash on it. And I made her some samples, and she said, this is what I want. And I said, okay, if this is what you want, I'll do it, but you have to promise to tell no one that Lowy knew. Until I went to her gallery and saw that in the context of what she was doing with the gallery, with her oriental rugs some Japanese, Chinese wall hangings and so on and so forth, it actually looked okay, which is, to Janie's point, the interior is an important consideration of the framing.
And it might have been the quality of light. The color
Yep,
probably looked
yep.
completely different.
That's true too.
Which leads you to Tony's next question.
Well, I'm completely out of order. I have no idea what my next question is. I'm going to ask, though, Kate, you were talking about slipping paintings in and out of frames, literally, but what about mentally? When you look at, you who are trained to look and focus on the artwork itself, can still sometimes be tricked? Can a wonderful frame elevate a mediocre work, and can also a terrible
It's
one?
like seeing somebody with perfect makeup across a crowded room, and as you walk closer and closer, you realise that it's not such a perfect set of face. I mean, it's evident that the frame will dominate. There's a fight between the frame and the picture. It's an exhausted Homer in a very glamorous frame on a wall of a gallery that found it for a steal. You get it. It's not a difficult thing to train a client to see. I really don't think. I think there's a lot of demystification that has to go on, and certainly in the art consultants business, I would like to put myself mostly out of the job for the simple reason that I would like most clients to walk in anything that they see, certainly in auction. They should bring a restorer in with them and a black light and someone that can give a good condition report. And it is very important to have this condition appropriately analysed. And they should look at it in daylight. Walk it to a window. Please don't look at that wonderful Ryman bleached out on the wall on the 7th floor and dismiss it. Can you please take it off the wall? Or there's a little Dubuffet sponge that's coming up for auction, which is just the most delicious thing. And it's completely overlit, and I had to look at it with a great conservator today, and we drew the blinds on it, and we were looking at it, and I said, it's wonderful, it can go in daylight, and I went, oops, no, it can't. It's going to dry out. What are we going to do with it? So all of these, you just have to have the expertise around you, but you also, as a client, have to be brave enough to look at the picture, not look at what you think the picture's going to look like. Don't look at the catalogues, don't look online. Get yourself down there, handle it, turn it over, look at it, inspect it, and apply your own eyes to it. And then have great experts to help you.
Sunlight is very, very important, not just for pictures, but also for objects. It doesn't tell any lies.
Never.
Do you ever want to really see the truth of
totally
something?
agree.
Sunlight will tell it to you.
I've walked more impressionist pictures out the front door of Christie's and Sotheby's to actually see them in sunlight, in daylight, in raking light.
In raking light. That's
Raking light.
That's
I
very
mean, and
important.
Joan Mitchell in raking light can look wonderful, and then suddenly it looks like a monster. It's got tons of things going. Or Bradford slip in their frame, they're sort of slipping stage left, and they look fabulous lit with a perfect box frame, and you take them to and you realise something went wrong with it. So but I think none of this is. I'm not a genius for observing that. It's just the rules. You must see it in daylight. You must take it out of the frame. You must flip it over. You must get a condition report, and you must not get an auction condition report because they are caveat emptor. Nothing I say is right. Please look with your own eyes and don't come back and try and give it back to me. I mean, really, use people that know how to do that.
And we are now doing more and more condition reporting for auction houses for that reason, because so many people complain about the condition reports written by auction personnel, and they should, because they don't say anything. And so when I write a report, our name is on the report. So people will then call me and ask me about condition, which is what I want them to do, because I can answer them honestly. And what Kate's saying is absolutely correct. The more you handle something and really look at it and get to know it, that's when you either fall in love with it or you don't. But you also realize the nuances. I mean, so much about artwork is the nuance. It's also, how it plays into the interior, but the object itself, when you buy a piece of art, you're buying, I don't want to say it's like having a child, because that's very cliche, but it's something that you've invested in, that you care for, and you have to treat it that way. So you should go into it with that in mind. Condition is very important. Yes, black lighting is very important. And what Stuart said before about black lighting is true. You do really need to have somebody there. What you're saying about pigments, true and every pigment has its own fluorescence. And oil, just to sidetrack a little bit, oil also has a fluorescence. So UV can tell you a lot of different information, and you really do need somebody who knows what they're talking about to explain that to you. I know Stuart was talking about this, we looked at it yesterday, what is it, the Theo Robinson, right? That has a red lake in it that fluoresces beautifully under UV, but a lot of people would mistake it for restoration, and it isn't. It's just this particular type of pigment fluoresces a certain way.
It looks like day glow.
Yeah,
Under
it's
black light.
actually really beautiful. And those pigments are also very fugitive to sunlight. So lakes are the first ones to, not the first, but they're very sensitive. So when you're buying a piece of artwork, when you're hanging it in your home, you also want to consult an advisor and a designer about placement and know the materials. I mean, know what you're dealing with, because these kinds of factors, sunlight, humidity, temperature, they're all very important in caring for your work.
No pastels hung by the front window. I have a dozen more questions I want to ask you. I want to open it up to you all. If you have questions, I invite you to ask them. If you don't, then I'm going to keep going, or you guys can just walk out the door. But
Tony, I know we have to end soon, but there's one thing that I really wanted to hear them address tonight, and that is about the order in which things happen. Because we're sitting here with people who spend their lives looking at great art, and we have someone here who spends their life looking at great space and how to put great art in that space. For Jamie and Kate and Stuart, a little more, sorry, Lauren, which comes first, the chicken or the egg? Jamie, do you like to find a space that's raw that you can work with to create the space and then put the art in? Or do you like to have a collector that has a collection that you need to tweak the space around the collection?
I think I'm comfortable working either way. What I'm not comfortable with is the client. And remember, not all of my clients, and maybe not even all of yours, are collectors. Many, many, many people are furnishers, and they're willing to spend substantial money furnishing. But they're not looking at it from quite the same way, and I don't think we should diminish their importance in the marketplace. And so I think the one thing I don't like is the client who doesn't want to have art, who, because by the time they've finished renovating or building and furnishing and making all those decisions and paying for them, that they have reached a point of exhaustion, whether that's decision-making exhaustion, emotional exhaustion, or financial exhaustion, and we'll do that next, and they never get to do it. That's the disappointing. I think that the challenge to work with an existing collection can be fascinating, and sometimes you need to work with it, and again, whether it's a fine collection or it's a personal collection, sometimes you need to suggest, well, maybe that would be better if we use it in a different way than you've thought of before. Maybe it becomes put in a more surprising place, meaning less important.
Mr. Laszlo. I have a question for all of you. I have a client, and was decorating this huge house, and she bought some great art, deep corner, this and that, so on. But we have like dens and little rooms, and we found a Picasso portfolio of things, and she said, well, they are beautiful, but they're not real. And I said, they are real. The image is real. And with a beautiful surrounding and a good frame, the image is still real. How do you feel about that, rather than a rather second-rate piece of art?
You're saying a reproduction. It's
a reproduction.
Great.
A good reproduction of it was the portfolio of Guernica from 20 years ago. And to me, I'd rather have those gorgeous images than second-rate art.
I think that's a very personal consideration. If you're happy with it, I don't think there's anything wrong with it.
I absolutely agree.
And at least if you take it to...
There's one variant on that, though, and that is that every once in a while I see a collection and I think to myself, not a blue Homer, but that's a fake. And when I see that, then I worry about everything that's in the collection where I don't have so much expertise
Yeah.
and think it's all sort of not so good.
Yeah.
I would also say to Jamie's point about building a house and putting a collection, I've done both curated wonderful collections, edited them down and worked with very talented people to put, to reposition. Downsizing is one of them. If they're moving to a wonderful apartment, they've got a great collection. I'm often the person, I think it's the best job in the world to go in and reimagine their collection in their new home with whomever I'm working with. I would also say if you've built a beautiful house and your pockets are now feeling, well fleshed out, time is on your side. I think that this instant gratification of I must have my collection and I've got to finish it because it's like choosing, it's like finishing a house. You do have to get into your house, but you don't have to grow that collection overnight. So if you have your Guernica prints wherever you wish to have them, that's perfect. And for me, they're place savers. I'm the art dealer. I want to sell you pictures. I'm going to say that those are my place savers for things that they could grow into. But don't do it all at once.
I should follow up.
Yeah.
What happens is often with those people, they never get around to it. I have a client, I just noticed my office was processing something for a contemporary garniture for down the center of a dining table. It's fabulous. I said, I can't believe you got her to buy that. She's buying that? Really? Really? And it was really expensive. I said, did she ever buy a single painting for that house? And this is maybe 10 years down the road? No. Huge expenditures in custom woven carpets for stair runners and a contemporary garniture and not a thing. She never pulled the trigger.
It's criminal. I think it is.
And it doesn't have to be. You can buy decent art. An emerging artist, contemporary artist. It's not hideously expensive. I'm talking about people with means. I'm not talking about somebody who can't afford it.
But you can, on any budget, you can buy whatever you please. But I think it's just the idea of going to people that are going to give you a quick fix. Often those consultants, those galleries that will give you a package deal that will deliver them all in the back of a truck and you can put them up and you might like them and you sign the check. It looks.
I love that.
You love it. Well, for you, that would be an area. I'd gladly do it with you. I'll find clients.
Listen, I'm going to take Larry's client to buy a Babar the Elephant book and
We're
take it
all
apart.
going to be leaning into
And
you
some
now.
thumbtacks. I mean, why not?
I'm going to say something that I really hate to say, and that is I think the institution of the serious, dedicated private collector, such as we all knew 20, 30, 40 years ago, I think that genre of person has sort of become a very, very rare bird.
Absolutely.
But
There
there's
is
a bigger
an-
collector. There's a collector who's still pouring significant money, but they're not doing it from such passion. They're relying more on advisors.
Well, yeah, but also there is what I call the over the collector. Somebody will come in here and say, I've decided to collect. Well, what are you interested in? Well, I'm interested in a picture for over the mantle, over the sofa, over the sideboard, over the bed. I need long and narrow over the bed, and over the this, and over the that. That's what I call the over the collector. But the serious collector, such as we knew years ago, and who, in many instances, formed the bases of great public collections, I think it's very old-fashioned at this point, unfortunately.
I'm hoping that we can grow them again. Because I do think that there are some people, young collectors, and I will defend some young collectors that are really confused by the current market, where we're going in and we're spending a huge amount of money on the tag pieces, the pieces that we're supposed to be buying, and that they say they'll phone me up. I had literally someone phone me up and saying, I love this Mark Bradford, but it won't fit. And I said, won't fit where? Well, where I want it to fit, the over. And I said, well, have you thought of another place to put it? No, but it's supposed to go there. And you have to train them.
That's the opportunity for us.
Yeah.
And
Move the damn sofa.
and our business opportunity is not to, again, I mean, I call it the furniture. Some people say, well, what does your client collect? I said, well, they're not really a collector, they're a furnisher. What do I collect? I don't really collect. I buy nice things, but I don't buy things and then put them in storage just because I'm passionate about them. And I think that our opportunity is to get them to another level, possibly, which is to think about it differently. It doesn't have to be long and narrow. Maybe it's an asymmetrical blob that hangs asymmetrical.
Well, this is all fantastic. I appreciate all of your insights and your time with us, and thank you.
Thank you.